Comparing Communism and Fascism, Part 5, Anti-Liberalism and Anti-Democracy. Very closely connected to totalitarianism and directly comparable to fascism, communism was vehemently anti-liberal and anti-democracy. Of course, how communism differed in many ways with fascism was that communism's anti-liberal and anti-democratic sentiments were masked under liberal and democratic rhetoric. This sentiment can clearly be seen in the example of the Russian Revolution of 1917. Tsar Nicholas II abdicated the throne in the spring of 1917, following mass unrest, primarily caused by the deprivations of World War I. After the Tsar stepped down, the Russian Empire was governed by a provisional government that sought to provide some continuity in government, as well as transition the autocracy into a Western-style liberal democracy. Prince Georgy Lvov was the leader of this provisional government for some months. In a speech, Prince Lvov laid out clearly his hope and intention to guide Russia towards a liberal democracy. Lvov told a crowd, quote, "The spirit of the Russian people has shown itself, of its own accord, to be a universally democratic spirit. It is a spirit that seeks not only to dissolve into universal democracy, but also to lead the way proudly down the path first marked out by the French Revolution toward liberty, equality, and fraternity," unquote. For the Bolsheviks, particularly Vladimir Lenin, it was not enough that the Tsar had been removed and a constituent assembly was to be created. Moving to liberal democracy was not enough for the communists. According to Lenin and other communists, parliamentary democracy was at best a half measure. Lenin argued that such democracy would inevitably be used by the bourgeoisie to continue the exploitation of the working class. While politicians and so-called Democrats purported to represent the interests of the common man, in actuality, parliamentary democracy was a system to fool the proletariat and keep them in chains. Lenin writes that democracy allowed the proletariat to, quote, "decide once every few years which member of the ruling class is to repress and oppress the people through parliament. This is the real essence of bourgeois parliamentarism, not only in parliamentary constitutional monarchies, but also in the most democratic republics," unquote. The main reason that Lenin gives to demonstrate that this new parliamentary democracy was a sham is because it was still bound by bourgeois ideals and was still caught up in the premises of capitalist exploitation. Lenin writes that, quote, "This democracy is always bound by the narrow framework of capitalist exploitation, and consequently always remains, in reality, a democracy for the minority. The majority of the population is debarred from participating in social and political life," unquote. So long as the proletariat played the game under the rules of the bourgeoisie, the exploitation would continue. Furthermore, Lenin was worried that if the socialist and communist parties accepted this new democracy, they would be sucked into the black hole of partisanship and electoral politics. The communists would be more focused upon winning seats than pursuing the revolution, let alone educating the masses about exploitation and Marxist theory. In playing the bourgeoisie's game, the communists would be defanged and more concerned with seats in the Constituent Assembly than challenging privilege. In noting this, Lenin very briefly praises the anarchists he so hated. Lenin writes, quote, "The anarchists were thus justified in saying about such a social democracy that it had betrayed the task of educating the working class for the revolution," unquote. By creating democracy, the bourgeoisie had cleverly saved their skins for the time being. By tricking the proletariat into believing they had been liberated, the bourgeoisie could continue to act as masters of the earth, sharing power with each other while the workers lived in squalor. Quote, Democracy for an insignificant minority, democracy for the rich. That is the democracy of capitalist society." Unquote. Furthermore, Lenin argued that all progress would cease under bourgeois democracy. The capitalists were trying to grind historical progress to a halt. Anyone who wished to achieve communism through democracy was fooling themselves. The only thing that could bring communism was the proletarian revolution and the dictatorship that would follow. Lenin writes, quote, "But from this capitalist democracy, progress does not march onward, simply, smoothly, and directly, to greater and greater democracy, as the liberal professors and petty bourgeois opportunists would have us believe. No, progress marches onward, i.e., towards communism, through the dictatorship of the proletariat. It cannot be otherwise." Unquote. Lenin continually degraded and insulted his opponents, particularly the members of the Social Democratic Party. He called them lapdogs and traitors to socialism. Not only were the Social Democrats ignorant of true socialist thought, but they were actively attempting to trick the working class in order to keep themselves in control. Lenin writes, quote, "The opportunists of modern social democracy accepted the bourgeois political forms of a parliamentary and democratic state as the limit which cannot be overstepped. They broke their foreheads praying before this idol, denouncing as anarchism every attempt to destroy these forms." Unquote. In praying to the false idol of democracy, the Social Democrats were foregoing their duty to the cause of communism. After all, according to Lenin, quote, "No kind of democracy will yield socialism." Unquote. According to the Bolsheviks, violent revolution against the bourgeoisie was still necessary, regardless of the presence of a constituent assembly and voting rights. What was needed was, quote, "the break from a bourgeois democracy to a proletarian democracy, from the democracy of the oppressors to the democracy of the oppressed classes." Unquote. Western-style liberal democracy was not true democracy, according to the communists. Lenin asserts that, quote, "Under capitalism, fully consistent democracy is impossible." Unquote. What was needed was a true democracy, a democracy of the working class, led unflinchingly by the vanguard of the revolution. For the communists, true democracy could not include any of the elements the communists considered to be oppressive. The bourgeoisie could not be allowed to participate. They were to be stripped utterly of all political rights. Lenin writes of this true democracy, quote, "Democracy for the vast majority of the people and suppression by force, i.e., exclusion from democracy of the exploiters and oppressors of the people. This is the modification of democracy during the transition from capitalism to communism." Unquote. The Bolsheviks were opposed to the provisional government and the Constituent Assembly for several reasons. They believed that the growing democracy would be a sham, nothing but a thin veneer on continual exploitation. They believed that engaging in this democracy would cheapen both the communist message and the ultimate goal. They believed that those who supported or engaged in this democracy were crooks and swindlers after their own power and glory. Further, they distrusted the new democracy because it did not meet their standard of a true democracy. In many ways, the communists argued, democracy would be no better than monarchy. Lenin summarizes these positions quite succinctly, along with his own recommendation of what is to be done. Lenin writes, quote, "Thus, in capitalist society, we have a democracy that is curtailed, poor, false. A democracy only for the rich, for the minority. The dictatorship of the proletariat, the period of transition to communism, will, for the first time, produce democracy for the people, for the majority, side by side with the necessary suppression of the minority, the exploiters." Unquote. Liberal Western-style democracy was a sham, and it ought not to be accepted. Only the dictatorship of the proletariat should be accepted. For these reasons, the Bolsheviks had boycotted the Constituent Assembly. Another reason why they boycotted the legislative body was because they had won so few seats, winning only 25% of the votes, as opposed to 40% won by their Menshevik opponents. As will be discussed later, the communists often had trouble winning free elections. Not only was democracy itself under attack from the communists, but basic rights were under attack as well. Some of the key pillars of liberalism, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, freedom of protest, were directly opposed to the plans of the communists. According to Lenin, certain groups of people did not deserve these rights. Further, it would be dangerous to give these people rights. Lenin was very clearly wishes to abrogate the rights of persons he does not consider to be people. Lenin writes that, quote, "The dictatorship of the proletariat produces a series of restrictions of liberty in the case of the oppressors, the exploiters, the capitalists," unquote. The very idea of natural rights, or negative rights, was anathema to Lenin and his Bolsheviks. Rights, particularly individual rights, presupposed bourgeois norms and capitalist relations of property ownership. In the future communist utopia, there would be no need for rights, because there would be no class differences. Lenin writes on this topic, quoting Marx to prove his points. Lenin writes, quote, "Equal right, says Marx, we indeed have here, but it is still a bourgeois right, which, like every right, presupposes inequality. Every right is an application of the same measure to different people, who, in fact, are not the same and are not equal to one another. This is why equal right is really a violation of equality and an injustice," unquote. This sentiment is a fundamental attack on the precepts of liberalism, particularly classical 19th century liberalism. Individual rights and liberties were not the only liberal precepts under attack. Equally under attack was the classical liberal notion of limited government, the idea of decentralized power being a bulwark against corruption and abuse was nothing more than a bourgeois fantasy. Lenin demonstrates this belief by quoting Engels. Lenin writes in State and Revolution, quote, "Engels disproves by a telling example the superstition, very widespread, especially among the petty bourgeois democracy, that a federal republic necessarily means a greater amount of freedom than a centralized republic," unquote. The communists attacked and rejected many of the key principles and tenets of classical liberalism. Of course, none of this was just theoretical nor mere rhetoric. The communists in action demonstrated their anti-liberal and anti-democratic beliefs. This can be seen directly in the coup d'etat orchestrated by the Bolsheviks in November of 1917. The summer of 1917 had been chaotic. Many Russians were despairing at the way in which the war with Germany was being conducted. While most Russians had supported the February Revolution that deposed the Tsar, most Russians still hated the war and wished it to end. An editorial in a Russian newspaper summed up the popular mood. Quote, "With the support of the people and the army to destroy swiftly and decisively everything that remains of the old order and that interferes with the new one, and to create just as swiftly and decisively everything without which the new order cannot exist," unquote. Despite this public sentiment, the provisional government under Alexander Kerensky continued the war. The Kerensky offensive in June 1917 was a total disaster that left hundreds of thousands of dead, thousands more wounded, with nothing to show for it. This military failure, combined with rampant famine, led to a mass protest. In July, 500,000 people flooded into the streets of Petrograd to protest the government and to protest the war. Behind the protesters proudly stood the Bolsheviks, who had refused to take part in the provisional government. Though the protests had quieted down by the end of the month, the crisis did not end. In August of 1917, General Laver Kornilov told his troops of an apocryphal uprising in Petrograd that threatened the Republic. Kornilov ordered his troops to seize the imperial capital and put down the rebellion. In reality, this was Kornilov's own attempt at a coup. Kornilov sought to re-establish the monarchy, citing the chaos of the July days as his reason. His coup, however, was abortive and ground to a halt when workers' Soviets met his troops peacefully. The summer of 1917 was extremely chaotic for the burgeoning Russian democracy. Fewer and fewer people trusted the provisional government. In sum, the honeymoon with the provisional government was extremely short, and now it was over. The provisional government stood on tenuous ground. It no longer had the support of most Russians and had alienated many of its backers. Further, the threat of the monarchy resurging was in the air. The Bolsheviks took advantage of this chaos. Lenin was tired of using the workers' Soviets as merely camouflage and wished to take direct control of the government. In October of 1917, Lenin led a Bolshevik coup d'etat against the provisional government. On the eve of October 24, 1917, before the Constituent Assembly was to convene in Petrograd, members of the Bolshevik-dominated Revolutionary Military Committee and a contingent of soldiers from the Petrograd garrison set to work, seizing telephone exchanges, railway stations, and power plants throughout the city. The Bolshevik-dominated Kronstadt fleet also contributed to the takeover when a warship, the battleship Aurora, leveled its guns on Kerensky's seat of government, the White Palace, and opened fire. Whereas the Bolsheviks found many volunteers to conduct the coup d'etat, the provisional government could find few to serve in the defense of a republic many saw as rotten and corrupt. As a result, the Bolshevik seizure of power was relatively bloodless, and most of the fighting was contained to the taking of the Winter Palace. Kerensky was forced to flee from the country. Following the coup, the Bolsheviks moved to cement their power. 2 days after the overthrow of Kerensky's government, the Bolsheviks created the Council of People's Commissars to lead the new government. The leader of the new government was Vladimir Lenin. Leon Trotsky was his right-hand man. Though the new government promised a fresh election, the Bolsheviks made it clear that they were unwilling to share any degree of power, even with other socialists. Sheila Fitzpatrick notes this, quote, "In November 1917, when the Bolshevik Central Committee discussed the possibility of moving from an all-Bolshevik government to a broader socialist coalition, Lenin was adamantly against it," unquote. The promised elections did take place. However, the results were not the liking of the Bolsheviks. The social revolutionaries won 40% of the vote, whereas the Bolsheviks could only muster 25%. Those who voted for the social revolutionaries were largely of the peasantry in rural areas, whereas, quote, "the Bolsheviks took Petrograd and Moscow. They had an absolute majority in the armies of the Northern and Western Fronts and the Baltic Fleet," unquote. The Bolsheviks had clearly lost the election, yet they did not step down. Lenin and his party stood firm and did not relinquish the reins of power. Sheila Fitzpatrick observes that, quote, "The Bolsheviks did not abdicate because they had failed to win. It was not the population as a whole that they claimed to represent. They had taken power in the name of the working class," unquote. Later, in January of 1918, another election was held. 36 million people voted. The Bolsheviks received only 9 million of these votes. There were 2 elections in as many months. The Communists had lost both elections. Yet, they persisted to hold the reins of power. This was no mere bourgeois democracy. This was the true democracy of workers' power the Communists had sought. Arguably, this is what sparked the Civil War that would rage for another 4 years. For the Communists, the only true democracy that existed was one in which the workers were dominant and all other classes were silenced. Further, because the Communist Party was the vanguard party and had the best interests of the proletariat at heart, therefore, in a true democracy, only the Communist Party was to exist. Mikhail Tomsky was a leader of Soviet trade unions and a close ally of Stalin. In a speech on November 13, 1927, he told an audience, quote, "We allow other parties to exist. However, the fundamental principle that distinguishes us from the West is as follows. One party rules, and all the others are in jail." Unquote. The irony, of course, is that Tomsky himself was eventually targeted in a purge, and he committed suicide before the secret police arrested him. Soon after the Bolsheviks refused to step down from power, they declared themselves to be the only legal party. All others were to be hunted down. Pravda was the official newspaper of the Bolshevik Party. With the rise of the power of the party, readership for Pravda grew exponentially. In an article in January of 1918, soon after the Bolsheviks refused to step down and essentially created a one-party state, Pravda ran an editorial praising the decision. In essence, Pravda argued that only the Bolsheviks represented the will of the people, even though they had lost 2 elections. The Social Democrats, Social Revolutionaries, and Mensheviks were all swindlers and liars that needed to be swept away. The author of the article writes, quote, "The hirelings of bankers, capitalists, and landlords, the allies of Kalinin, Dutov, the slaves of the American dollar, the backstabbers, the right-essers, demand in the Constitutional Assembly all power for themselves and their masters, enemies of the people. They pay lip service to popular demands for land, peace, and worker control, but in reality, they tried to fasten a noose around the neck of socialist authority and revolution. But the workers, peasants, and soldiers will not fall for the bait of lies of the most evil of socialism. In the name of the socialist revolution and the socialist Soviet Republic, they will sweep away its open and hidden killers." Unquote. But this propensity to eliminate their enemies should not be altogether surprising. It occurred time and time again. Historian Karol Bartosek observes that, quote, "Everywhere it was the aim of the communist parties to eliminate their actual or potential adversaries and to crush all political, ideological, and spiritual competitors. Marxist-Leninist doctrine demanded that the rivals be wiped out for good, and all means to that end were considered legitimate, including death sentences, execution, long prison sentences, and forced exile in the West." Unquote. Worldwide, while the communists proclaimed to be the voice of the people, they were always in the minority. Perhaps this is a major reason they were so opposed to democracy. The example of the Bolshevik seizure of power is not unique. It was replicated in many, if not all, of the communist nations. There was a continual disregard of democratic norms, let alone a willingness to share power with like-minded parties. In Hungary, a group known as the Smallholders Party had been active in the Hungarian resistance movement and had even won 57% of the vote in the 1945 elections. They were widely popular. Even though they had won the election, their party was systematically dismantled by the communists. Their leaders were arrested, some being sentenced to death. The Independence Party of the People's Democratic Party suffered similar fates. In Czechoslovakia, as in many other communist nations, quote, "There was never any attempt at power sharing, political pluralism, or parliamentary democracy, even if the parliamentary system was formally retained." Unquote. Often the Soviet Union justified their military interventions in other countries on the grounds that the communist parties of those nations were under threat. Often they were threatened by democratic and liberal upwellings. When the Soviet Union invaded Czechoslovakia in 1968, they used as a pretext a document sent by Antonin Čapek, a key communist official in Czechoslovakia. Čapek, in this document, directly requested Soviet military involvement so that the Soviets could, quote, help in repelling the forces that not only are guiding the process of democratization of the socialist society to crossroads, but, in essence, are creating serious danger for the life of socialism, unquote. The communists, particularly the Marxist-Leninist variety, were adamantly opposed to both liberalism and democracy. Both were tainted with bourgeois sentimentality and norms. Both were seen as mere tools of the exploiters to keep the working men down. Both would invariably be swept into the dustbin of history. Neither would be necessary when the new communist world was achieved. When the new men walked through the Elysian fields, they would have no need of liberalism nor democracy. The communists detested liberalism and democracy for many of the same reasons that the fascists detested them. They were not authentic representations of a holistic community. They were hangers-on from a bygone age. Furthermore, the fascists and the communists tried to destroy both concepts in much the same way. Historian Vladimir Lenin draws this comparison very directly when he writes, quote, both revolutionary party movements execrated and denounced liberalism, democracy, and parliamentarism as degradation of true politics, which would transcend all divisions through the establishment of perfect communities, unquote.